Welcome everybody to the 41st episode of Comic DNA, on which we will be discussing Supreme by Alan Moore, Rick Veitch, Joe Bennett, and Chris Sprouse. And yes, I can't believe I'm actually saying this, a name I never really thought we'd be talking about on this podcast, but Rob Liefeld. And a couple of other prominent creators who contributed to this book, but I don't have all of their names with me off the top of my head. I am Aaron Walther, and with me today are two returning guests, Mr. Anthony Mathenia. Anthony, thank you for being here.
Glad to be back.
And my good friend, Mr. Tim Albaugh. Tim, thanks for also being on the show.
Not a problem.
So, we are here to talk about Supreme. Now, just a little background on Supreme. First of all, Tim, I know you've read Supreme before. Supreme was one of the books that when I was getting back into comics, when I was just kind of in high school, I was kind of just soaking up everything that Alan Moore had written. And Supreme was relatively recent, a superhero book that he had done, and it looked interesting, so I bought it. And through me, Tim, I know you read it too, and I think it's safe to say that you liked it quite a bit.
I really liked it.
Yeah.
Still one of my favorite comics that I've ever read.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, I know we've talked a lot about your history with reading comics in the Miracle Man podcast, and how that was that was the first Alan Moore book you read, right?
Yeah, that was my entry point into Alan Moore and my re-entry into comics.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about Miracle Man and how Alan Moore, his deconstruction of the superhero as a concept. And when we were doing those podcasts, I kept telling you, we really should read Supreme. It's an interesting counterpoint to Miracle Man. And it's quite a different book than Miracle Man. But I think it's a really interesting book because it's not one of the Alan Moore books that people regularly talk about the way they talk about books like Watchmen or V for Vendetta or League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, or even his DC work like Swamp Thing or Batman: The Killing Joke. But honestly, I think Supreme is hands down one of my favorite Alan Moore comics that he's ever written. And there's kind of a lot of history and some backstory to stuff that was going on behind the scenes in the book, so I'm going to try and go over it as briefly as I can. I'm sure, Anthony, you probably didn't have any knowledge or understanding of a lot of the, what Supreme was referencing or the stuff that was going on behind the scenes with the character when you were reading the book, right?
Right. I understand when I'm getting into it, it's obviously a reboot of this character. I have no idea what he even was before.
Right.
And all that. I mean, I wasn't even aware of this book's existence.
Exactly.
That was the same way with me when I first read it.
Total lack of a comic cred here.
Right.
Well,
when I first started reading it, I was really worried that I wasn't going to understand a lot of it because it was very obviously coming in the middle of something. But then the first 10 pages or so, they're like, just ignore everything that came before. This is brand new. In the book, they're saying this. So I was like, okay, I guess I can get on board with this.
Yeah. And like I said, it's not a book that I see. I think it's certainly a book that has recognition. I mean, Alan Moore did win an Eisner for Best Comic Book Writer in 1997 for his work on Supreme. So there is an appreciation for this book, and I think there are some fans that really like it. But yeah, in the greater comic book pop culture phenomena, people don't really talk about Supreme. It's not really important the way his other works are, So but yeah, so a little bit of history about the character. Supreme was created by Rob Liefeld in 1992 as a spin-off character from his Youngblood series, which was being published by Image Comics. And if you're familiar with Rob Liefeld or Image Comics of the early 90s, I'll just say that Supreme was exactly the type of character you expect him to be.
Violent.
He was hyper-violent, yes. Dark, pretentious attempts to seem philosophical or deep by having superficial ties to spirituality and religion. Frankly, it was awful. Just awful.
Yeah, it was bad even by Image standards.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Apparently the book had its fans. I'm sure it did. Rob Liefeld has his fans. I'm sure there are people that like the book. But I really would say it was just like truly just trash comics. Ostensibly, Supreme was supposed to be a satire of Superman, but he was a representation of Superman as if he had no moral restraints and just used the full extent of his powers all the time. So basically, instead of being a character intended to be read by 13-year-old boys, Supreme was a character that was as if he was created by a 13-year-old boy.
And honestly, like a lot of those early Image superheroes, he may have been. Because all those early Image guys, they had the characters that they had created when they were kids.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah. I mean, even Eric Larson's Savage Dragon, I think that was something that he did as a kid that he finally eventually got to do at Image.
Same way with Spawn.
Spawn, yeah. So, yeah, just, but even for the Image comics, like, I mean, Supreme fit right in, I'm sure, because all those books were all about, just dumb action, really violent, and not much of a focus on any sort of story or meaning or theme or anything. It was just all style over substance, I tell you, the 90s must have been a hell of a time to be publishing comics, because Supreme somehow made it to 40 issues. 40 issues of Rob Liefeld Supreme. I'm baffled by that, but it truly was a different time.
Hey, what did he even write about 40 issues with that character?
Well, it was
Just like violent rampages over and over again?
Well, that was another thing, I guess. I haven't read. I've looked at a few issues, but I really have not sat down and read it, and I'm not going to. I think what I've seen is enough to see. But like part of the thing with the character and was that there was no continuity. Like the character was dying and coming back, and just kind of like it really was like a testament to like Rob Liefeld's poor grasp on storytelling. Because there was just sort of like, if he thought an idea was cool, he would just go with it, and even if it didn't make sense with anything that had seen before, So like the Supreme continuity across those 40 issues was just a hodgepodge mess, confusing mishmash of stuff that didn't make sense.
Right.
And so, in 1996, Rob Liefeld made what could be considered his only good career move, definitely his best career move. And he hired
best and only good
career move. And he hired Alan Moore to revamp and write the comics in his Maximum Comics line, or Extreme Studios, actually, is what it was at the time, which that's a whole nother thing. Including Youngblood and Supreme, and some of his other books. Alan Moore's only condition on writing Supreme was that he could throw out everything Rob Liefeld had done in the book and completely restart it from scratch. And of course, this is an Alan Moore book, so it's very metafiction. So naturally, the book starts with everything being retconned, but the main character, Supreme, is aware of the revision. And from there, Alan Moore weaves what I would say is the most thorough homage to Golden and Silver Age Superman comics ever to see print.
Yep.
But there's still more backstory. Moore's first 12-issue arc was very well received. As I said, he won an Eisner for it. And he agreed to do another 12 issues. Unfortunately, during the second story that Alan Moore was doing on Supreme, everything kind of started to fall apart behind the scenes. Now, Rob Liefeld, I don't know. I'm sure. I mean, he's a big name in the comic book industry. If you have a passing interest in comics and comics fandom, I'm sure you know who Rob Liefeld is. And he's kind of the punching bag of the comic book industry, mostly because of his art style. His figures have notoriously bad anatomy. He traces a lot of panels from other artists.
A lot of pouches.
Yeah, a lot of pouches. Like, stylistically, he never draws feet, barely draws hands. Yeah, pouches, big guns. Yeah. Often, and his characters that he creates are often just juvenile imitations of already existing Marvel and DC characters. Like I said, and kind of like what I agree with you, Anthony, it was implied, it really is, all his books just feel like they're written like a 13-year-old, by a 13-year-old, I should say. But I gotta be honest, I do have to be honest when I say it. Back in the 90s, when I was a dumb kid, I did really like some of Liefeld's comics. I have to completely admit that. Now, I was mostly a Marvel reader, and I didn't really follow any of those guys to Image, because I liked the characters, and I didn't so much follow the creators. So I never really got into Rob Liefeld's Youngblood series, but I did like his X-Force book when he was doing it. But I like people disliking Rob Liefeld because of his art. That's one thing. Art is subjective, and like I said, I think Liefeld's comics are pretty trashy. But that's just my opinion.
When I was
go ahead. Yeah.
When I was I don't know how old I was, maybe like 13, maybe 12 or something like that. I had those X-Force things, and I didn't even blink at the art. I was like, oh, this is really cool. This guy's.
Oh yeah, no.
Look how big this gun is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, I read like all the Nightfall comics and the Night's End comics, and apparently nowadays, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is what they claim, is that they drew all the characters in that to be like super like ridiculous, like Liefeld style, as like a satire of that era.
I've heard that. Yeah, they say that.
That's what they claim. But I mean, like, I never blinked an eye at it either. But like when I go back and look at those issues now, it's like it is the most god awful art I've ever seen.
Yeah. I think that was Joe Quesada was doing some of that on that Batman. Yeah. And yeah, he has said that the character Azrael was just sort of like a parody of what all the Image guys were doing.
Right.
I mean, I can kind of see it. I can, but at the same time, it's one of those things like how far does a parody go before it just becomes pandering and just becomes exactly the type of thing that it's parodying? I don't know. I guess that's the difference between like a clever parody and just pandering. So, but yeah, like I said, Liefeld I think does have his strengths. I think he makes trashy comics, but if other people like it, it's really no skin off my nose.
I think he's really good at creating characters that other people take and then do much better things with.
Right. Cable and Deadpool.
And Deadpool.
Yeah. Yeah. What I do dislike most about Liefeld was that he seemed to be a pretty bad, or worse, maybe even a shady businessman. When the Image artists left Marvel to form their own company, Image Comics, they all had their own studios that were independent of each other, but they all published under the Image brand. So, for example, Jim Lee published books under Wildstorm, Mark Silvestri had Top Cow, Todd McFarlane had Todd McFarlane Productions, and so on. And Rob Liefeld had Extreme Studios. Now, they would all be put out under the Image banner, but they were all basically their own companies, like their own studios. They had their own employees working for them, and they didn't answer to anybody but their own studio. And they just all agreed that they would put the Image logo on their books. And they were all partners in the company of Image. So Rob Liefeld at the time, his position was CEO of Image Comics. But Rob Liefeld also had a second studio called Maximum Press, which was not associated with Image. And this is where he published comics that did not fit with the Image brand. And I have no idea what kind of criteria they were judging it by to determine whether or not it fit with Image.
What could you possibly come up with that doesn't fit with the Image brand?
And they all look pretty much the same to me. But it was a different time. They certainly were doing their thing, and they had some concept of a brand they were trying to protect. That's fine. Well, in 1996, shortly after Supreme was relaunched with Alan Moore writing it, Liefeld was effectively fired from Image Comics. For a whole load of reasons that I think are largely speculative and never confirmed publicly by the parties involved. But the general consensus is that Liefeld was misusing his position of CEO at Image to promote and possibly even financially support his Maximum Press comics. And there was also some personal beef between Mark Silvestri and Rob Liefeld. Silvestri was upset that Liefeld had poached artists out of Top Cow Studios, specifically Michael Turner, who was doing Witchblade, and I guess Liefeld poached him to do some stuff for his books. So as a result, Liefeld left Image and created a new publisher called Awesome Comics. I know, Extreme Studios, Maximum Press, Awesome Comics.
Awesome Comics is the best one.
It certainly is the best one. I will agree to that. And that's Awesome Comics is where the rest of Supreme was published. But wait, I've got still more backstory to unload on you. So, to make a very long story slightly shorter, it was only a few years before Awesome Comics completely collapsed financially due to internal disputes and what were probably some other shady business decisions. The tragedy of Awesome's collapse is that it left Moore's Supreme run completely unfinished. Moore had the second run plotted for 12 issues, and the penultimate issue was scripted, but it was never drawn. At least not until over 10 years later. In 2012, just a few years ago, 12 years after Supreme had been unceremoniously canceled and leaving the story unfinished, Image Comics published Alan Moore's final script, which was the penultimate issue to his 12-issue arc. Eric Larson drew Moore's unfinished script, or not? Yeah, it was a finished script, but for the unfinished story. Eric Larson drew the final script, and then he wrote and drew 5 more issues to finish off the story. And hoo boy, is it something else? But we're not really going to talk about that right now. I just really want to talk about Alan Moore. So, Anthony, you are somebody who probably doesn't know a whole lot about Superman or Superman comics, specifically Golden Age and Silver Age Superman comics. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I was never, even as a kid, I didn't read Superman at all. The only thing Superman that I've read that I think is Alan Moore's, was it The Man Who Has Everything or something?
Yeah.
Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow?
That's actually two. There's 2 of them. It's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow and What Do You Give the Man Who Has Everything? That's going to bother me now that I can't think of the exact name. He drew 2 stories. Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow was officially the final Superman story that ended the Silver Age of Superman comics. That was like the final, all the continuity that they had done of Superman from the creation in 39 up until like 85 when that was. That was the final story, and then they relaunched it with John Byrne's version of Man of Steel. But yeah, that's probably. I mean, I think it's a good comic, but yeah, I can understand why that'd be like the only Superman comic you read.
So yeah, I've got a feel for what he's going for, but other than that, I was just having to enjoy Supreme for the story's sake, not having the reference to a lot of the meta narrative there.
Right, and as I kind of implied earlier, the meta narrative that Alan Moore is going for is that Supreme has been retconned in story. Like there's a revision going on, and Supreme is aware of it. And so the whole comic sort of explores this idea that there are all these past versions of the character being Supreme. But in true Alan Moore fashion, since it's a meta-narrative, Supreme's powerful enough to realize, or at least be conscious of it. And so the whole book, there's a lot of homages to 40s comics, 50s comics, 60s comics, 70s comics, just all different types of Superman, essentially. That's what it is. It's an homage to Superman. And they specifically, I'll just say, the first story, what it does is it introduces this limbo world called the Supremacy, where the character Supreme goes to, and he sees that it's just populated with thousands and thousands of copies of himself. And they're all different versions. So he meets like 50s Supreme, which was the Supreme that existed in the 1950s. Even though the character of Supreme that we're reading about, his past, he was live in the 50s, he's not the 50s Supreme, the one that was created in the 50s. And then there's like, there's all these different versions. Like there's a cartoon mouse version of Supreme. There's my personal favorite, which is Grim 80s Supreme, which is drawn to look exactly like Frank Miller's Marv from Sin City. So there's all these different versions of Supreme. There's Original Supreme, which was the first one that was created in the 30s. There's I forget the most powerful one is the one from the 60s. I forget what they called him. But so there's all these different versions of Supreme. And that just sort of like opens up this idea that it's sort of like taking it like it's like parallel worlds, but they're not parallel worlds because they all exist in the same world. They're just constantly being changed. Obviously it's a meta narrative for comic books, and comic books are an ongoing series. They're constantly, telling stories and then changing and stopping and restarting and altering the character to fit the times and whatnot. So, Anthony, as somebody who really has no interest in like the ongoing style of superhero comics, or maybe even the history of superhero comics, what was your first impressions of reading Supreme, especially compared to Miracle Man, which was the previous like Superman archetype story that you'd read? I don't know. Would you say that Miracle Man is your favorite version of like Superman?
Yeah, I mean story-wise.
Story-wise, sure. Okay. So what do you think? What was your first impressions of Supreme compared to that?
No, it was like a totally different thing, because when you open up Supreme, there's no getting around, first of all, the 90s art.
Oh,
and that just takes you...
Right.
I mean, Supreme's anatomy and muscles on the first, splash page there. But I don't know what I'm expecting really going into the book until you start getting into the little segues where they go back and kind of recreate old comics from the 50s and 60s and stuff like that.
Yes.
That's kind of what hooked me more than the 90s story that was going on.
No, I completely agree. That's actually what got me too. The great Rick Veitch does all of those homages to classic comics. Rick Veitch, he did draw an issue of Miracle Man. And he's done some other stuff with Alan Moore, but he's a really good artist, but he does really great pitch perfect style parodies of Golden Age and Silver Age comics. And yeah, that's absolutely what hooked me when I was reading this book. Just seeing like whenever like Supreme is flashing back to an event that happened in the 60s, the comic is drawn in a 60s style. I really loved that.
Even at one point, well, I mean, there was a lot of those that were just so crazy. Where they did the Mad magazine.
Oh yeah, they did.
Oh yeah, that was one of my particular.
That was like spot on the style of the Super Duper Man or whatever, the Superman parody of Mad. And there was another one where they go back and have like old newspaper Supreme strips.
Yep.
Where you've got like characters like that look like Popeye and stuff coming in, and just all of that's just perfect, not just in art but in the way that they're written.
Yeah, it's. I mean, Alan Moore really goes out of his way. Like it really is like a perfect homage, satire, parody of these old comics. They're just pitch perfect. So there's a lot of that going on in the back and forth. But I did like Alan Moore's his satire. It was a lot more lighthearted in this book than what he'd been known for previously. And I had seen in an interview, Alan Moore had basically said that he decided to write Supreme as an apology for what he had done on like Swamp Thing and Batman and all the stuff beforehand, which is it is pretty funny. It is pretty ironic. There's sort of like a delicious irony to like when you're thinking about it. Like Alan Moore kind of got famous for taking all of these children's characters and turning them into like dark, complex, adult, like violent, real world takes on these characters. And then as a result of that, in the 90s, all the new characters were just like really, what I would say, pale imitations of that. I mean, all of Image Comics books were just trying to be, realistic, violent versions of superheroes, but they were really, really poorly written, poorly done. Like they didn't have any substance.
They didn't have the depth.
Yeah, they didn't have any depth that Alan Moore put into it. So I just love that he took the most violent and the most shallow of all of those characters and turned him into the deepest and most complex homage to a children's character. He's just completely reversing what he did to Batman and Superman. But it's just perfect to me. I just love that he does that.
That's one thing I think that comes through when I read it, was just how much fun he was having with this homage he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing this book at the same time. He's also working on Lost Girls and From Hell.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they're two very, very different and deep works.
Mm-hmm.
And then just to still be able to cut loose with this character.
Yeah, I think it's also a really funny book. Like there's a lot of really good jokes in it.
This actually is these books are actually the ones that made me like Alan Moore.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd read League of Extraordinary Gentlemen before this, and I didn't care for it.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of back when I was first getting back into comics after, like, I was into them as a kid, and then I kind of fell out of them. And then in high school, I started getting into them. And I read League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and I was very put off by it because it was so grim and dark and rapey.
Right.
Like a lot of Alan Moore stuff. And I read this, and it was like, it's so different than everything he does. I mean, it's still very Alan Moore because it's all like meta.
Yeah.
But it's also just so, like you said, like lighthearted and funny and comic booky and like it's. I don't know. It really is the book that like turned me around on Alan Moore.
Yeah, I think it's a really smart book, first of all, and what I really really like about it is that I think what Alan Moore set out to do, which I think he accomplished in spades, is to show that you can write a kid's book or something that is playing with these big, unrealistic situations or plot devices, and you can still write it with the depth and complexity that you would an adult story. It wasn't that he in Batman the Killing Joke. It wasn't the fact that the Joker sexually molests Batgirl that makes it an adult comic book. It's right. The way Alan Moore gets into the characters and the way he structures the story, the way he paces it, all these kinds of things. That's what makes it like a really deep comic book. Although I'm going to put a little asterisk out there and say I actually don't like the Killing Joke that much. But I can see why people like it. But I actually think it's probably one of Alan Moore's weakest books that he's done. But I'm just saying, I'm just using that as an example. It's not the rapey stuff that makes it really deep and adult. Exactly. Right. And I think he really goes out of his way to show that in Supreme. It's Supreme as a book is just as complex and intellectually stimulating as it is just like pure childish fun.
Right.
And that's why I really like the book. I also love that we're talking a little bit about like Alan Moore's stylistic choice to use rape quite often in his all of his books. I think nearly all of his books. And Supreme is almost the only one that doesn't do it. There is technically a character, like rape is addressed in the comic, but it's done in such a satirical, tongue-in-cheek way that I give it a pass. Which is when, in the second series, when Supreme takes his girlfriend, Diana Dane, the Lois Lane character, to the Supremaverse, and she meets all the alternate versions of herself that are girlfriends of Supreme.
That's right. Isn't one of like the grim 80s?
One of them is grim 80s version of Diana Dane, who is a heroin junkie and a rape survivor and just like a total nutcase. That's the only time that rape is really mentioned in the book, and it's done to make fun of the stuff that Alan Moore was doing in the 80s. So I totally approve.
And later on, there's the grim 80s Darius Dax, who's like a cross-dressing serial killer.
Yeah, he's like transvestite serial killing Darius Dax or something like that. Yeah.
Wasn't there also another reference to it when the Jimmy Olsen character?
Yes, Billy Friday.
Billy Friday.
I was just going to bring that character up. Yeah.
Okay, so he's he's also commentary on the Alan Moore British.
Right, he's like Alan Moore's self-insertion character.
Right. And
he don't they mention that he had like bad reviews or something from some rape book he did with Radar, the Supreme dog.
Yeah, he did. I remember him talking about like he did do an issue where like Radar got raped or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like because that character was complete self-mockery. Well, I mean, I'll say self-mockery, but I think it's also mocking just like stylistically the trend at the time, because it's not like Alan Moore was the only British writer who was like indulging in this. He just kind of was like the biggest and the first. But yeah, like, because Billy Friday is a British comic book writer, and all he does is talk about how they're gonna make, they're really gonna get into the core of these characters and tell like serious stories, and they talk about like the where he had the dog got raped, and he's always talking about killing off characters and giving them like emotional problems and all this complexity.
Yeah, the super villains, he wants to talk to them about their childhood.
I love that joke. So like one of the coolest aspects of Supreme, one of my favorite parts of the story, is that in Supreme's the Citadel Supreme, where Supreme like it's like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's a big floating citadel that he has, and he's got the Hell of Mirrors, which is there's a bunch of mirrors that are a portal to another dimension, like Alice in Wonderland kind of thing. But it's just like a barren wasteland, and that's where he puts all the supervillains that he captures that are like super powerful and whatnot. And there's that great moment where Billy Friday gets trapped in there, or they have to put Billy Friday in there. And later on, you see all the supervillains are begging Supreme to take Billy Friday back because they just can't deal with him anymore. They can't put up with him. He keeps asking them all these questions about their parents and how they feel about things, and they don't care about any of that.
They just want to be evil.
Yeah, exactly. They just want to be bad guys. But he keeps trying to probe them about their feelings and what their motivations are, and that's a great joke. Yeah. It's also there's also a really great joke with Billy Friday is that the plot device of Supremium, which is kind of the main thing of the whole first story arc. Supremium is sort of like kryptonite. It's a space rock it's a rock it
both gave Supreme his powers and is like his only weakness.
Yeah, it's like a special form of radiation, like it's an irradiated rock, and it gives him powers, but it can also like kill him. And when people get exposed to it, like it does things. So, like it can kill them, it can do things. It's what gave Supreme his powers. Billy Friday gets exposed to it, and he starts like multiplying his body. Like he just keeps like growing more and more arms until like he just becomes this giant mass of arms. And it's such a perfectly beautiful visual joke. It's that the British. He's literally just becoming more complex. Like his body is fractaling, and it's becoming more complex at a geographic rate, which is just like such a make fun of British comic book writers, because they just keep getting more and more complex and more and more complex until it's completely unbearable. And that's why they have to shove him in the hall, because it's like an open world. Like he's going to destroy the Citadel Supreme if he keeps growing and growing and destroying everything. So
it gets reduced to like this fractal, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good joke. Like I like the way that's portrayed. But let's talk a little bit about Supremium and how that's used in the story, because I think that's it's not just like a really good plot device, because it's very clearly like a take on kryptonite, but I think it just really wraps up like the whole story, like builds through all around these events with the Supremium, and it comes to this really, really perfect conclusion. What do you think? I'm hesitating whether or not I'm gonna spoil the book of like exactly what happens, like every little plot point. But Anthony, what did you think about the conclusion of the first story arc? I mean, we can talk about it in detail if we have to. I'm just...
What I think impressed me about it was how all throughout the first series, it feels kind of like loose, right? Mm-hmm. You're reading through, and then you've got all these like flashbacks to old comics and stuff.
It's kind of disconnected. Yeah, like each issue...
It doesn't feel like there's a thread to it.
Right.
And then when the ending comes around, it kind of comes out of nowhere.
and it
not out of nowhere, because you should have been able to see it all along.
Right. You can kind of see it coming, I think, by the time you get to it, but it really does just tie it all together beautifully.
Takes all these threads that he's been interweaving here, and then just kind of like pulls them together in this unique tapestry.
Yeah, I think it works really well, but I also think, I mean, like, I'll just say, like, the way the story is. So when Supreme is Ethan Crane, that's his alter ego. When he's a young boy, he's out in the woods, like he's like a 6-year-old kid, and he sees this meteorite that's crashed on just out in the forest, and it almost kills him. Like, he gets exposed to it, but his dog saves him and drags him away from it, and as a result, he and the dog both have superpowers now, like the Superman. And as the story progresses, you kind of just get these different, like, you're getting all this little backstory about the different times that Supreme has interacted with Supremium, and all these different characters and how it relates to, like, his the mythos of Supreme. One of those characters is the Supremium Man, which I think that was the issue that was drawn by Rob Liefeld, or at least it was credited to Rob Liefeld. I don't know how much of his studio assistants drew it, but because I gotta say, honestly, that was some of the better Rob Liefeld art I've ever seen, which really makes me suspicious of how much of it he drew. But anyway, that issue, I really like that issue, because that's the issue that's like the circular loop, where that ties together all the Billy Friday stuff. It ties together the character of the Supremium. Is that the Supremium Man? Is that what they were calling him? I forget now.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And how, like, it starts in the past, and Supremium Man travels back in time to visit, or no, Darius Dax pulls him there. Like, he just has like a made up machine that just like draws the Supremium Man there, and then he goes into the future and becomes, like, the Supremium Man becomes Billy Friday, and they like combine to become a new person, and then he gets all he's gonna get revenge at Supreme, so he goes back in time to kill Supreme, and it's just this constant loop of the time, like a time travel loop.
Right, because he like keeps falling back further and further through time.
Well, that's the ultimate end. This is actually like the penultimate story with the character of the Supremium Man who tries to kill Supreme, and that's what happens to Billy Friday. But like, he keeps going back and forth to these two moments in time, like where, like, in the past, that's the first time he tried to kill Supreme, and then he goes into the future, and that's where he kind of becomes the Supremium Man, and he tries to kill Supreme, and he can't do it, so he decides to go into the past, and he kind of like loses his memory as he's doing it. And I really like that. That's the first instance we get of, I think, what Alan Moore's true kind of message is with this book and a lot of the themes that he set up, which is that these superhero stories exist in a circular loop, that there are no beginnings and there are no endings. Everything is just constantly spinning wheels. And that is driven home in a couple of different points, specifically with the major ending, where Darius Dax comes back and he melds with the Supremium to become the new Supremium Man, and he's going to kill Supreme, but he keeps absorbing more Supremium until he becomes like too heavy for reality, and he falls backward in time and eventually becomes this meteorite that gives Supreme his powers. Right. So again,
which I thought was a really cool.
Oh, it's great. Like, it's really great. Like, not only is it just like a perfect, like catchy ending, like, it's just such a fun little ending. Like, it ties it up all nicely, and it, again, it kind of like brings everything together. It ties everything to the story together, but it also ties into, like I was saying, with this main theme of the circular events of the story. Like, it kind of, at the end, you're just kind of like left wondering, like what is the point? Do the motivations of these characters really matter? Because everything that they're doing is just this circular, preordained, like, pattern, because it's all being created by a writer, Alan Moore. And that's sort of like this. I think that's a wonderful commentary on superhero comics. And there's another moment actually that's really nice that kind of hits that home in the big ending when all the villains get out of the Hell of Mirrors and they're all gonna like get revenge on Supreme. There's one villain that all the other villains are really scared of, and he's just a villain called The End.
I thought that was such a cool moment.
Oh, it was so cool.
They bring Supreme to him, and they're like, "Do you want to finish him off?" And he's like, "No."
Yeah.
And they're like, "What? I thought you'd want to be at the end." And he's like, "This is not the end. I am the end. Go away."
Yeah, that's a really great moment, especially because they never show The End as a character. Which again, that's another like Alan Moore's being very specific and very clear there. There are no endings. There's no such thing as an ending. There's a character called The End, and we never see him, and he refuses to participate.
Yeah,
I love that.
That's so great.
Yeah. and like that's the only time you see him, and all the other villains are scared to death of him.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't want anything to do with him. They're trying to do it to like gain favor with him, I guess. Why they bring him Supreme. But yeah, that's a great moment.
So do you think it's like a true theory there? Do you think like 200 years from now there'll be a version of Superman for that era?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe that. Unless, barring something like the destruction of, human society or something like that, I think it's gonna. If you really want to really get into it, I think it's gonna get really tricky in another 30 years or so when we have to start dealing with these bullshit copyright laws. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. Sorry.
No, you're allowed to soapbox on this subject.
Yeah, so we're going to get to a position where Superman is either going to enter into the public domain or we're going to have to create new copyright laws. So, but either way.
But, even if you look at Superman, the original Superman in 1938 and the new 52 Superman now, they're so different.
Oh yeah.
It really is exactly like what's going on in the
Supreme, yeah.
In the Supreme.
And I think that's going to keep happening. You have Superman right now, Man of Steel Superman, and you can go back to the 70s and see Christopher Reeve Superman. You can go to the 90s and see Dean Cain Superman. It's not even relegated to comics. This is just pop culture.
Right.
But Superman's going to be around forever. If and when he finally falls into the public domain, people will still be making Superman comics forever, and it'll just increase the differences. There are going to be so many different Supermans, and I think that's really what Supreme. That's kind of what it's about.
And then civil wars break out over the true Superman.
Now, that's the fans' problem, not my problem. Although I do think that that is going to be a problem for a lot of fans. I don't want to speculate too much on the buying habits or the psychology of the comic book fan, but I do think a lot of them need there to be one version, an official version.
I think that is a lot of... I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of obsession with official versions and continuity in comics.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Hardcore, and it's like some fans are just obsessed with knowing what is canon, what isn't canon. What is the official story, and I don't know, it's kind of silly. Because they change what's canon all the time.
Exactly.
So why obsess over
Exactly,
it?
which is exactly what Supreme is about. There is no what is the point of worrying about canon? It is always just going to change and be different, and it's just spinning its wheels. There is no beginning, there is no ending, because these stories are not told in a structure that's designed to give you any sort of cathartic release. They're just designed to perpetuate.
Talking about Superman, for example.
Sure.
And, before the New 52, I had no idea. I don't even think DC even knew what Superman's official origin was anymore. Because they had already... Man of Steel, or Superman the Man of Steel, was for a while in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And they retconned it with Birthright.
Yeah.
Then they retconned Birthright with something else.
Right after.
Right.
I tell you one thing, again, I'm not trying to soapbox too much, but the thing I hate most about superhero comics, I hate origin stories. It is the easiest thing in the world to do. They all follow the same boring formula, and people eat it up. And I think there's a reason why people, comic creators, like to write origin stories. I think there's a reason why, specifically, people like to go back and tell Superman origin stories. Is because it's basically the only story you can keep telling in a superhero comic. You can't tell an ending story. I mean, you can tell a death story, but it doesn't mean anything. You know,
Right.
you can...
It's never canon.
Exactly. Like, you can't have the character, like, retire or be satisfied. Like, these stories just, like, people don't want them. All they want is to see, like, the new and different way that it all starts, and then just perpetuate that.
Right.
But yeah, I especially hate Superman origin stories. I think the best Superman origin story of all time was the one-page, three-panel origin story
I was
in
just gonna bring that
All-Star
up,
Superman.
Yeah, where it's literally just them putting him in the ship, he crashes, he gets found by his parents, and then boom, we're off to the story.
Exactly. Because that was a story that was about an ending, too.
Yeah.
Which, we're not going to talk too much about All-Star Superman. We'll save that for a different podcast. but yeah, so I do think that, I mean, you know, talking about even if and when Superman goes into the public domain, Time Warner will still publish a Superman comic. Just because it's in the domain, in public domain, doesn't mean they won't publish a Superman comic, and that will.
And they'll still be like, it's
the official one. That will be in some people's eyes the official one, but only then will we finally get to see the full free market of ideas in effect, and fans can decide whether or not they like DC's nonsense, or if some other creator, like maybe me, decides to make a Superman comic, and I'll win everybody over. And I'll be the god.
Keep extending this.
So that's why you hate copyright so much. You just want to use everyone else's
No. Well, no.
Oh man. Oh hey, I'm waiting for a crack at Mickey Mouse.
Exactly. Yeah. Boy, good luck on that one. Oof. But yeah. We kind of got off on a little tangent there, but it's all right. I mean, I would say, I mean, like, talking about like official versions of Superman and whatnot, I mean, I would honestly say that Supreme is my favorite Superman story ever told. I certainly think it's one of the best.
Supreme?
Yeah, Supreme. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just because he's not called Superman, it's still better than.
No, I think Supreme and All-Star Superman are the two best Superman stories ever told.
Yeah, I can sign off on that. Yeah, I would agree.
Do you think Supreme? Do you think, obviously the character is a proxy for Superman, but do you think it would have been as effective as a straight up Superman story?
Now that's an interesting question, because I think it could have been, but I do think there's kind of a little bit of an asterisk to that. By having it be a proxy and by having it be an homage, that sort of freed up Alan Moore to not have to. It gave him a little bit less restrictions, a little bit more freedom. Like he wouldn't have to try and make everything gel with specific continuity. Like he wouldn't have to have very specific versions of Lex Luthor in the Lex Luthor universe. He wouldn't have to have very specific moments in continuity. He wouldn't have to go through all these back issues and try to find moments that he's trying to draw together, which is essentially what Grant Morrison did with All-Star Superman.
I was going to say, and also with the difference between Supreme and Superman is that, like, Supreme, like, this wasn't, in order to do this with Superman, he either would have had to have done it in, like, the official, like, continuity with like, a real short editorial leash, or he would have had to do it in, like, an Elseworld story, and
it would have basically been
wouldn't have had the same
exactly
impact.
the same, because he would have just ignored all the actual continuity and made up his own 70-year history of Superman.
Right.
Exactly. I think that's what is likely. That would have been likely the only way that the Supreme story could have worked as a Superman story. And then in that case, yeah, I actually say it would have worked. I was trying to think of an example of kind of like something that I really like in Supreme that's not like a 1-to-1 ratio conversion from Superman. I really like the way the dog, Radar, the Hound Supreme, I actually kind of like him more than Crypto.
Yeah. And also, like, Supreme's origin story is very
different. It is different.
Like,
yeah, he's not a baby.
He was a human boy born on Earth, and he wasn't like an alien. It was like it was him encountering an alien object that gave him his powers. And, I don't know. There is stuff. Honestly, I kind of like a lot of the Supreme stuff better than the actual Superman stuff, and I think it's because Alan Moore had the freedom. He had more wiggle room.
Well, and he had the hindsight to like look back on like what worked for all these different archetypes and put it all together into a perfect structured story.
Right.
Because that's the problem when you're trying to create a story out of 70 years of continuity of a comic, is that it's very shaky. Like, it's not a strong foundation because it was never intended to be like a strong continuity, you know. Whereas the way Alan Moore did it, all these specific backstories that he's referencing are done in such a way to specifically reinforce this idea of this long intercontinuity, you know, this long structure.
Right.
So in that way, I do think that the story probably works best as a Supreme story instead of a Superman story. Mm-hmm. Just to kind of flip flop on exactly what I just said. I can see both sides of it. I can.
Right.
What kind of threw me off about the way it was written, and I don't know if you got this at all, but even like the modern era stuff seemed to be still written in like a 70s Superman type. So
yeah, it was. I think that Alan Moore was being very conscious not to write a modern comic book. Like he was very conscious in trying to present what he saw to be an updated version of a Silver Age comic in the present day.
Right. Like I just turned to a random page, and it's actually the page where Billy Friday is like multiplying out of control, and Supreme says, "By the constant moaning of the Khazars."
Exactly.
Constant moaning of the Khazars. It's like, yeah, that's not modern comic speak.
And I think that's very intentional. Like Alan Moore, the intent is to just say, look, you can have this like classic, you know, kids character, and you can do him in the present day, which is the 90s, and you know, it can still work.
It's just so weird for me to see the Rob Liefeld type art.
Now that's true, yeah.
Those dialogue balloons.
That's very true.
Or with the characters just sitting there talking to themselves.
Yeah. I do think that the second book, I do think that the art improves quite a bit when they get Chris Sprouse on the book. You know, no real disrespect to Joe Bennett and the other guys that were drawing the first series, but they really were just sort of very much 90s art. But in the second book, Chris Sprouse, he's a really good artist, and he kind of gets like it fits with the times. Like, you know, it looks like a 90s comic, but it doesn't have all the. It's not what I would call stereotypical 90s art. Like I think to put it simply, he still draws really good figures. Like Chris Sprouse's Supreme has good anatomy.
He's anatomically
correct.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's anatomically correct. He looks like a believable. Like I don't want to say he looks like a real person because he still, you know, is a huge muscle superhero, but like it's not as ridiculous as the Liefeld.
Maybe the upper torso just doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't just
explode out of
yeah.
like just muscles on top of muscles.
Right. And I mean, Chris Sprouse is a great artist. He still works in the industry. He did do more stuff with Alan Moore after Supreme. He did the Tom Strong series, which the Tom Strong series was basically very similar to Supreme. If you like Supreme, I would recommend reading Tom Strong. Except instead of being about superheroes, it's about like classic pulp stuff, like The Shadow and Doc Brass. Is that? I might be thinking of Planetary by Warren Ellis. Which is also that. Man, those British writers, I tell you what. But yeah, I do think that the art improves in the second one. The second book also has an issue by Jim Starlin, who's a classic comic book artist. He did. I know. I read some Silver Surfer comics that he did. He's the one who created Thanos for Marvel. And of course Rick Veitch is still doing his thing.
Then the artist for Lost Girls.
Yes, you're right.
Melissa, was it Gaby or something
Melissa
like
Gaby. Alan Moore's wife. Am I correct?
That's what I'm remembering, but I'm not certain.
I didn't fact check that, but I'm I was pretty sure that they eventually got married. They started working on Lost Girls like a long time ago, and it didn't get published. I mean, they were working on it for like 20 years actually. But yeah, she did do a story, like a short, one of the, it's one of the, it wasn't one of the flashback ones. It was where
the Supreme Sister.
Ah, yes, where Judy Jordan comes back.
Yeah, Judy Jordan's like super powered.
Yeah, she gets the robot body.
They have a ruckus.
Yeah, they have the spat Supreme. I love that.
God, the Supreme
puns.
Oh, everywhere.
I love it. Oh, it's perfect. It's beautiful.
One of my favorites is when the Supremium man comes back and he keeps changing Supreme.
Oh yeah, and he's like becomes like a marionette puppet, and what do you say?
Yeah, and then he's modern art Supreme.
Yeah, that was great. Modern art Supreme. Yeah.
I like wordplay throughout, and like the when they did the Mad Magazine parody with Supreme, man, just,
Melvin.
Yeah, Super
yeah,
Melvin.
that one.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, the dialogue in that, you know, with the little rhyming thing that he had on. Oh, that was so much fun.
It was really like a perfect Mad Magazine parody, like that.
Yeah, a parody of a parody magazine.
Of a parody.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I guess we call that a pastiche.
It was to do right wrongly, but not right.
Yeah, yeah.
Make sure you write the right wrongs and not the wrong wrongs or something.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, it's really good. I think on top of like what we were saying about like the ongoing story that kind of ties it all together, I think what I really like about the book is the like present day '90s story, and how all the stories really are Alan Moore trying to just take these like silly old concepts and kind of revive them in like a new, in like a what's the word I'm thinking of? Like in an appropriately complex and deep way, but while still not abandoning like the just like the fun, childish appeal of it all. And like the one story I'm thinking of specifically, which is one of my favorite ones, which is the story about Radar, when he gets jealous of Supreme having a girlfriend, so he decides he's going to go try and have sex, and then he just can't help himself, and he like impregnates like 100 dogs.
500 dogs, yeah.
Because he's super powered, so he's just flying around, and suddenly all these dogs are pregnant. And I don't know, that was really funny, and just the way they resolve it by, like, it's sort of like Alan Moore being like, okay, here's a superpowered dog, you know, we're gonna address something that you would never address in an old comic book, which is a superpowered dog sex drive. But then it ends with like an appropriately old Silver Age kind of style thing of Radar just being like, all right, I'm going to round up all my dogs and we're going to go find another planet and we're just going to live there and build a new dog society. So now you just have a planet of super dogs, you know?
Yeah.
And, like, this book was like every crazy idea, and what kept like throwing me was like I didn't know if like, okay, is this referencing like some Superman story that I've never read?
Right,
back in 64.
I think a lot of it was just I don't think a lot of it was that specific. I think it was more just general pastiche.
More the tone and style.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tone and style. I certainly haven't read a lot of old Superman comics, so I couldn't tell you specifically. But like you can look at the characters and be like, okay, I get that this is kind of a pastiche on these characters. But yeah, I don't think it was really meant to reference like a specific issue. Like, for example, just to repeat myself from what I said earlier, have you read Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, Anthony? Okay.
Oh yeah,
because that
really
one, very similar to Supreme in that it's like a pastiche of old Silver Age comics, but Grant Morrison goes out of his way to reference very specific things and very specific issues and like very specific instances and kind of tie it all into like a new story.
Well, that's the thing about Grant Morrison when he writes through DC, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but Grant Morrison is very continuity.
He loves his continuity, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting how similar and how dissimilar Alan Moore and Grant Morrison are, considering that they hate each other just with a passion.
I did
Well, that's
not know
what I'm
that.
thinking. Is like as I'm reading Supreme, it's calling to mind some things that I remember from like Flex Mentallo,
Yes.
which is also
Yeah,
commentary
Flex Mentallo is another good example.
on comics. And then at the same time, like going forward, a series that's just came out was like Grant Morrison's was it
Multiversity, yep.
which was also had a lot of this. Oh, it's just a comic book type
Mhm.
thing, and here's all these versions and variations of these people.
Yeah.
You know, it was like you said, for them to be like dissimilar, which they are. They deal with similar things all the time in their books.
But I think that's also like part of like kind of a trend that was going on, particularly among British
I was
writers.
gonna say they both kind of came up. Well, they were British writers, and it was just kind of like the era that they.
Yeah,
wrote in.
but I mean, like we can look at specific Alan. Yeah, I would say that Alan Moore was the first one to do it, and so then you kind of get into this argument of like, well, obviously some people are going to be kind of trying to imitate Alan Moore because if he's the super successful one, and that's what people want more of, if I'm trying to get work from an editor and the editor says I really want to see stuff like Alan Moore, I'm going to give him stuff like Alan Moore. So.
Like, do you think these artists wanted to draw like Rob Liefeld? It's demoralizing to go to work every day.
Oh my gosh, there's a specific case, a specific artist, and I can't think of his name right now, but I remember reading it on Comic Book Resources, Comic Book Legends Revealed series by Brian Cronin, and he talks about that. There was a kind of a famous artist who had been in the industry for a while, who in the 90s shifted his style dramatically to be like a Liefeld imitation, and a lot of people were upset about it, and there's this rumor, or the urban legend was that he had been forced by editors to draw like Rob Liefeld. And the dude straight up said in an interview that nobody forced him to do it. It just was common sense. That's what was popular, and he wanted to get more work, so he decided to try out that style.
Yeah, these places have their house.
Oh, absolutely,
like
yeah.
DC, everyone's tried to draw like Jim Lee,
yeah. But yeah, like a lot of these British writers, like you can look at their series. I mean, even like Neil Gaiman and Sandman is very similar to like the early on in the Sandman series, he was drawing on early comic book history. It kind of went off into its own thing, which is I think why it holds up. But like another series that was actually being made at the same time as Supreme would be Warren Ellis's Planetary, which I referenced earlier. Not a British writer, but I think Bill Willingham's Fables also kind of falls under this umbrella of like books that are pulling other continuity and kind of commenting on like past art. I mean, there's a lot of styles of books that do stuff like that. But kind of going back to what we were saying, it is interesting that Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. Very, very similar, but also I think there are some key dissimilarities between them. Well, that was a nice another tangent. So we've been talking a lot about the first book. What did you think, Anthony, about the second book, despite the fact that it was unfinished?
It didn't have the impact on me as the first book, but there was some really great fun stuff that happened in them.
The second book definitely cuts way back on the flashbacks to Silver Age stories.
I think so too. Yeah.
There are a lot fewer of those. Like it focuses more on the modern Supreme and what's going on in the modern world.
While still at the same time, though, still having those type of stories.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, it's still like the same language and tone of the issues that came before it. Definitely.
So, like, some of the fun stuff to me was where Supreme has to fight Omni-Man, which in the continuity, Supreme's alter ego works. He's a comic book. He's a writer,
artist.
Right?
Ethan Crane is an artist.
He's an artist. Okay. So he works on this book Omni-Man, which is basically like Liefeld's original Supreme.
Right.
And they have to fight, and you basically have more making fun of Omni-Man.
Yeah.
Right, like there's the scene specifically where Supreme punches Omni-Man. He's like, I don't hate you because you're evil. I hate you because you're badly written.
yeah, that was great.
So that was like weird and fun. And then the one where like Supreme's in this other alternate reality where he's a Confederate racist called Supremacy.
Yes.
Right. I forgot.
And it's like this alternate reality where due to like some.
That's the one where the what are they called? The Legion? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, their version of the Justice League.
Well, it's not actually the Justice League. It's their version of the Legion of Superheroes, and there's like the teenagers of time, that's not the name, but it's something to that effect. And yeah, that's the story.
Infinity something.
Yeah, the League of Infinity. Thank you. The League of Infinity. And one of their members, Wild Bill Hickok, goes back in time and changes the outcome of the Civil War so that the South wins.
Right.
And then Supreme is like aware of this revision because
like he's like because there's one point where he's putting on his costume. He's like, I don't know why this was the only costume I had in my closet.
Yeah, it's got the Confederate
jack on it.
The rebel flag.
Yeah.
And that's another like fun story that's kind of playing with a lot of what was established beforehand, and also playing with all the weirdness of time travel and.
So yeah, these stories, like even though they're we keep saying it's a 90s, it's a modern one, they're still like just crazy and zany and like more just doing whatever seemed fun while still developing another. Narrative.
And I think there's also just like a wonderful balance between like they're like you're saying crazy and zany and all these like big 70s style ideas. Like there's a supervillain called the Televillain. And his power is that he can go into TV shows and interact with the characters, which is just awesome. That's such a great character. So, like, what is he, like, what kind of use is that power? So, like... Isn't
there a scene where he, like, jumps into Friends and he kills Monica?
He goes into Friends and kills Monica, and then he, like, tells the viewers, he's like, give me $100,000 or I'm gonna kill Ross next. And, like... And, of course, there's, like, even this great scene where, like, the news is reporting and they're like, all the actors, like, the actors have phoned in to say that they're perfectly fine, but the public outcry is just outrageous that their favorite characters are getting killed. Like, he's such a, like, yeah, he's such a like dumb, perfectly like silly villain, but at the same time, it's balanced so perfectly with the who's the negative Supreme? What's he called? Shadow Supreme. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Man, that's what a great character that is. He's just like he's the evil version of Supreme. And Alan Moore plays him off as straight evil. Like all the other villains are like kind of creeped out by him because he's just like this bloodthirsty psychopath.
Oh right, there's the part where he murders Radar, and he's like, "I killed your dog."
Eventually, and there's just like blood all over the walls. Yeah, I like it. It does a good job of kind of like giving you all different types of characters. And I think, again, not to belabor the point, but I think that's what Alan Moore's intention was, and I think he succeeded well, which is saying to make a good comic, you don't have to just have like over the top violence. You can do all this stuff. It can all be in there. You can do whatever you want. Just make it good,
Right.
I loved just thinking about the villains when all the villains escaped and the space tyrant goes and challenges Bill Clinton.
Go fight at the White House for like control.
And he's gonna what does he call Hillary? He knocks out Bill Clinton.
And he's gonna take his woman as his queen. And then he ends up like surrendering because he can't handle her nagging.
He can't handle Hillary Clinton nagging him all the time. Oh my god. Oh, it's so perfect. Yeah, because that's that great joke where like Supreme shows up and the tyrant runs out and he's like, "Oh, Supreme, thank God you're here. Look, I'll make this quick. Just hit me really quick. Just hit me. I'll make it convincing."
Right.
I totally stole that joke for Zero's Heroes. I absolutely did. Yeah, Supreme was a big influence on me. I stole a lot of stuff from it actually.
Oh, Supreme was a huge influence on me for the Celestial. I mean. I don't want to say plagiarism, but
I would never say plagiarism because that would get us in trouble with the people I don't want to talk to. But
the Celestial was directly influenced by Supreme. I mean, like the
Celestial, that's a comic that you write. That's on NewHavenComics.com along with my comic Zero's Heroes.
right.
And
Right. But like in the story, the Celestial she's like a godlike superhero. She's super powerful, and she's written almost with a sort of awareness of what she is, and like the story started with her coming back to Earth after an absence, after she killed her archenemy, and it was, I don't know, it was just very like a lot of stuff, like the whole her archenemy being dead from the beginning was something I took from Supreme. And like even like when I used to doodle character designs for her, I'm not really a great drawer by any means, but my character designs for her were always very similar to Supreme's costume. It was just like everything about Supreme really spoke to me and made me want to write like an all-powerful Superman type superhero, and the Celestial was definitely the direct result of that.
And that was like that was largely like a subconscious thing, you think?
Yeah, I think to a degree it was subconscious because like I didn't start writing the Celestial until a couple of years after I read Supreme.
Right.
So I mean, and then looking back on it, especially like when I was rereading the issues for this podcast, I was like, you know, I really took a lot of ideas from this comic and didn't even really realize it. But
well, I mean that's the way art is, and especially
right.
especially with like like you're saying, like specific things that have like a very profound effect on you, especially at a certain age, I guess you could say, like when you're at that really receptive age. Because I mean that's how I am with Alan Moore. Like I kind of soaked up a lot of Alan Moore and then just was like, I want to do this. And you know, looking back, you're like, it really wasn't as good as the way Alan Moore did it, but you learn.
I will go as far as saying Supreme is probably the thing that made me want to write a comic book.
Okay.
Reading Supreme.
I mean I love Supreme.
Because kind of like covers such like kind of the like it kind of covers the gamut of what a comic book is supposed to be, like from like all angles and all aspects, and it really is like the perfect like superhero comic book.
And you know the other thing too about it, like I agree, I do really think it's kind of the perfect superhero comic, and there aren't many other comics that feel like Supreme, you know.
Right.
Like there aren't a lot of comic, like it still feels so different than like a standard comic book. Like it still feels different from, like it still feels like an Alan Moore book, but it even feels different from a standard Alan Moore book, you know?
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's so self-contained. It doesn't have to, you know, it's not in the never-ending story of, you know, like Superman.
Right. Well, I mean, do you want to talk about Eric Larson's continuation of the series? Because he put the nail in the idea that it would be a self-contained Alan Moore masterpiece. I can tell you that.
Yeah. Well, I prefer just to.
Neither of you two have read it.
Acknowledge.
Yeah. Neither of you two have read it.
I think part of the reason why I was resistant to reading is I didn't want it to ruin.
I had to read it because it just kills me that the story is left on a cliffhanger like that, like this unfinished. Oh my gosh. So like the second book ends. I think
it really is a killer cliffhanger because it's like, it really ends. It ends with Darius Dax being brought back to life by the Daxia or whatever, and like go out there and get Supreme, and he's like putting all this stuff together to like, you know, go after Supreme, and then it just
it even ends with like this like perfectly, again, Alan Moore is a master plotter when it comes to making these comics. So that issue number 10 ended in a very specific point where it ends with this ominous ending where everything's about to go insane and go nuts. And it even ends with the juxtaposed line, which is the characters are saying it, it's supposed to be innocent, but the subtext is that there's something really scary going on, which is, to briefly explain the story, as we said earlier, there's the moment where Supreme takes his girlfriend Diana Dane to the Supremaverse and like introduces her to this whole concept of all these other Supremes. She is the writer of the comic book Omni-Man that Supreme is drawing, or Ethan Crane, his alter ego, is drawing. So she decides to take all these ideas for the Supremiverse and put them into the Omni-Man comics. So now we're getting like layers on layers on layers of like meta-comics and meta-comics. We have a meta-comic that has a meta-comic inside of the meta-comic.
Very British.
So yeah. Elaborate lad.
Elaborate lad, yeah. I was also going to say real quick before we get too deep into what you're talking about, I'm just flipping through the second book. I love the part where Supreme talks to God, and God is Jack Kirby's giant floating
I was
head.
totally going to bring that up, yeah. No, the whole homage, that whole issue is just a beautiful homage to Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
And that's another one, that's actually one of the few instances. There's a lot, like you were saying earlier, Anthony, about, like you felt maybe you were missing out on something because some stuff, like if you didn't get the references. I shouldn't have brushed that aside so quickly, because there are moments where there are very specific references, and that Jack Kirby one is probably the most specific out of anything. And I know you're not too familiar with like Jack Kirby comics, correct?
Yeah, but
sure, it's hard to be into comics in any form and not know of Jack Kirby. But like that whole sequence where he goes, there's a hidden city in like the Himalayas, and he's going through all these different segments, and they're all different styles of Jack Kirby comics. So there's like the New Gods section, there's the Young Boys Brigade section, there's the War section, like war comics, and it's just all these like Supreme is just baffled how all these different styles and how can all of this exist in one place? You know, it's so bizarre. And then he finds out that it's because it was all created by one guy, the King. You know, they don't call him Jack Kirby, but it's Jack Kirby, and he calls him the King, which is what Jack Kirby was called, Jack King Kirby. That's really great. I really liked that issue. Like the whole hidden city in the Himalayas. That's kind of a reference to the Inhumans in Fantastic Four.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just beautiful homage to Jack Kirby. But as I was saying about like the pacing, because that was the final issue. That's what we're talking about here. So like Supreme goes on that adventure while Diana Dane is writing this comic, and she has it all finished. It's like they have like the make ready version of it, and it ends with like Supreme getting back and he sees her and they're talking and they agree like they're gonna be in a relationship and everything's happy. It's like, you know, it's like supposed to be a beautiful happy ending, and they're talking about the comic, and she says something, you know.
She says, "I hope that the Supremacy doesn't mind me writing about them in a comic book." And he goes, "What could writing about the Supremacy in a comic book possibly?"
Yeah, he's like, "How could a comic book affect anything?
How could a comic book affect?"
Yeah, exactly. How could a comic book affect the Supremacy? And like, there's very specific panel placement where it zooms in on the comic. Now that is very clearly supposed to be a dark, ominous panel, because clearly it's setting up to what happens is that Darius Dax is going to discover the comic book, learn about the Supremacy, and all hell's going to break loose, because that's what he's setting up for. And that is what happens in the next issue that you guys haven't read, because it wasn't published in 2000 when the series was finished. It was published 12 years later in 2012. I'll refrain from talking about it too much. Not a lot has been said about those 6 Eric Larson issues. Suffice it to say, they are not good. They are kind of everything. They are everything that Alan Moore's Supreme is not. It's like in an unironic way. Like it's. That's all I can say about it. It's unfortunate that Supreme didn't get a proper ending, because it really was one of my favorite superhero books. But I mean, I guess we got 22 issues of great stuff. That's something, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it just does kind of like leave the whole second, like you're saying, Anthony, the second volume, it doesn't do much for me, just because it's unfinished, first of all, and it just doesn't have that like perfect complete package that the first volume has.
Yeah, you've got in the first volume, it's It's the Alan Moore narrative all the way through, and it's going to what he's building. And then when you get to that moment, it's like, hey, this is great because you've got that payoff. I can see like how you're describing it. I didn't read the Larson ones, but if it doesn't like wrap it up and bring it together like that, then it's just kind of like it's wasted.
Doesn't do anything of the sort. In fact, it's almost funny in what it does. I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but
no, it like. Oh, I was gonna say you were telling me about it, and it like literally undoes what Alan Moore Supreme does by bringing back
Rob Liefeld's version of Supreme.
Rob Liefeld's crazy Supreme.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's essentially like that's the way Eric Larson tries to kind of like placate both fans of the series, because apparently there are people that like Rob Liefeld's version of Supreme. I have to imagine they exist somewhere, but certainly not my type of comic book fan, I guess. But yeah, he brings back Rob Liefeld's version of Supreme, which is a violent psychopath, and proceeds to just like kill everybody. And not only does he like start to undo everything, or undoes everything that Alan Moore did, I'll give him credit. He does try to play within the rules that Alan Moore set up. If Alan Moore starts this book and he creates this idea that there's this supremacy and all these past versions of Supreme exist in the supremacy, it stands to logical intercontinuity reason that Rob Liefeld's version would also be in the Supremaverse.
Yeah, it's
valid. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is that the books, I just actually think they're poorly made. I mean, I like Eric Larson. I really do like Eric Larson. I respect the hell out of him. Out of all the Image creators, he's the only one who's consistently written and drawn his own book for his entire career. He didn't ever stop. He didn't ever bring other people in to do it. He didn't ever just like sell out and just make toys for the rest of his life, or take a position at DC as like a high up executive publisher or whatever. Eric Larson is just making comics, and I actually have a deep-seated respect for that. Those Supreme issues though are just awful. Like, from like a craft point of view, reading them right after an Alan Moore book, oh my goodness. Like, there's no pacing, there's no expert, like, everything just feels so random, mishmash, hodgepodge. It's difficult to read. Like, it's actually difficult to read. But most importantly, the reason I dislike it is because it completely unironically doesn't resolve anything that Alan Moore set up. And all it does is set up new stuff that never gets resolved, because Eric Larson was only going to do those 6 issues to set up a new status quo for if someone else ever wanted to come on and do it again. So the Eric Larson issues themselves end on like a pointless cliffhanger. That infuriates me to no end. Like, they had the chance to like finish the story. I will accept, if it wouldn't be that good to have Eric Larson finish an Alan Moore story, fine. He wants to do his own thing, fine. But there's no story there. It's not anything. It's nothing. All it is spinning more wheels and setting up more stuff that never happens. Which again is why I say it is sort of ironic, because that's what Alan Moore was commenting on in the first volume. This idea that superhero comics are just like, they have no endings, and that all they are is just like cyclical stories. Right. But it's unironic. I don't think that was the intent. I don't think it was Eric Larson's intent to give us like a purposely bad, stereotypical superhero comic, the type that Alan Moore was making fun of, because there's nothing funny about it. Like, it's played straight. So that's my little rant about Eric Larson's run. It was quite dissatisfying. I imagine it would even be dissatisfying to people who like the original version of the character, because like I said, there's no actual story there. Like, nothing happens. It's weird. It's actually really weird. I would almost recommend you guys. I actually would really recommend you guys to read it. You could read the Alan Moore's issue.
It's awful. Read it, guys.
Well, I would, because first of all, there is an Alan Moore issue that you haven't read. So there's a script of Supreme by Alan Moore that you haven't read yet. I would almost say you have to read it just for that. It's drawn by Eric Larson and Corey Hampshire. But that's good. That's setting up the penultimate issue, and you read that and you're like, I don't know, as somebody who, like, if you've read all the previous issues, you enjoyed the first volume, you know Alan Moore, you understand what this book is. You read that cathartic penultimate issue, and you're like, I know exactly kind of where this is going to go, and I really, really, really want to read it and see how Alan Moore, like, pulls this off. And then it doesn't happen. And instead, Eric Larson swoops in and just starts spinning some wheels and just going off in all kinds of weird directions. It's a very interesting experience, although I cannot say it was a pleasurable one. But I'm kind of a masochist in that sense, so. But yeah, the Alan Moore issues are great. So, Anthony, if there were more superhero comics that were like Supreme, would you read them?
I would say probably not, because I don't know.
Well,
I enjoyed reading Supreme, but I feel like I don't necessarily need more of that.
Well, that's what I was about to say. There's almost this sense that because the uniqueness of it, because it's like the only thing that does it, that is partially what makes it, like, really good. Like, I almost have to say, like, if Alan Moore were just to keep going on it indefinitely, it would start to take the shine off of it. You know, like the whole, this type of story can't be told indefinitely. You know, it loses its uniqueness, which is what makes it interesting to read.
Well, like, I also read Alan Moore's 1963.
Oh, I didn't know you had read that, because I'm a big fan of 1963. Also left unfinished, by the way. Those image guys.
Yeah, so, but it's a similar thing where, you know, he's doing like an homage. Mm-hmm. That time it's to the Marvel,
very specifically Marvel.
And to that time period. But, you know, I read those and they're enjoyable, but, you know, if that was like an ongoing series of, I forget what the characters were named, you know, that wouldn't be anything I'd read, but, you know, in small doses, it's really cool.
Yeah.
1963, that was the one where, like, each issue was like a pilot issue of, like, a Silver Age Marvel style.
Yeah, so they had a parody, they had like a Spider-Man Daredevil character, they had a Hulk character, they had a Thor.
There was a Egyptian god that was basically
that was
like
Thor.
a Thor character. That's the one I remember most.
And they had
then you had like the Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
I really like those. Oh, those issues are all drawn by Rick Veitch. He's doing pastiches of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and John Romita, I think, maybe.
And Rick Veitch is the guy who did all the retro art.
Correct.
Supreme,
yeah,
right?
That's correct. That's Rick Veitch. Now, Supreme is a little different than 1963. 1963 was very much a pastiche. Like, it was the intent was to just do something in the style, and it was making fun of it as much as it was just doing.
I was gonna say it was a little more mean-spirited.
Well, because Alan Moore doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about Stan Lee, so he was or Marvel in general, exactly. So it was a little bit more of a parody pastiche where it was taking some jabs at Marvel. It was still entertaining and still fun. Whereas Supreme was definitely, it's a lot more of like a loving homage to Superman. Although, obviously, Alan Moore certainly has issues with DC Comics as a company. He still likes the classic Superman comics.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Anthony. I was really curious what you were going to think about it, because it's so different from Miracle Man.
Yeah.
Like, I guess what I like about it is that it's still Alan Moore. Like, it's still Alan Moore being, like, very deconstructionist and meta, but in a very different way. Because, like, Miracle Man is more of, like, a deconstruction of the superhero as a mythology and the idea. And Supreme is more of a deconstruction of the superhero as a product, as, like, a mass-produced pop culture icon.
And as a result, I think it's a lot less heavy.
I agree, yeah.
And more playful. And I think I don't know. You get to see if you miss like Alan Moore's like early stuff. He had that kind of like zany playfulness to it. That kind of like went away when he kind of went more serious and stuff with stuff.
Was Watchmen first, or was Killing Joke first?
Killing Joke was first.
Okay, because that's definitely when that's basically when comics started getting dark.
Actually, I'm gonna fact check that right now because that's gonna bother me because I'm pretty sure that Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns came out very similar time. But I'm almost positive. Actually, it was probably around the same time as Watchmen. Now that I'm looking at it, yeah, Killing Joke was 1988, and which I think was the same year as Watchmen.
I thought Watchmen was 86.
Yeah, Watchmen was 86, 87. So there you go. Watchmen was first. Yeah, I don't know shit about comics. Thank God I got the internet. Yeah, because that's right. Watchmen and Dark Knight were like mid-'80s, and then Killing Joke was sort of like the pinnacle of Alan Moore's dark take on the superheroes. Because after that, he had his proposed pitch for his big like Justice League crossover. Oh, I forget what it was, like War of something, where they all like go crazy and like fight each other. All the superheroes like create their own like factions, and it's like dark and hardcore. And somebody, I think cooler heads prevailed. Somebody at DC was like, "Nah, we're not going to do that." But it was a very detailed proposal. Like, it exists out there. You can read about it. It was going to be like, I think it would have been like it would have been the tipping point. I think it would have not reflected well on Alan Moore if that book had come out. Because I think Killing Joke already kind of doesn't make him look that great. He has since denounced it. He says it's probably the worst thing.
Yeah, I know that Alan Moore doesn't like.
He says it's probably the worst thing he's ever written.
Alan Moore denounces a lot of stuff. So
he denounces. Alan Moore denounces anybody who claims to be a fan of Grant Morrison. He says if you like Grant Morrison, don't bother reading his books. Puts me in quite an ethical dilemma.
I think that puts a lot of people in an ethical dilemma. Everybody likes both of them.
Exactly. I don't care. I don't care what Alan Moore thinks. Just shut up and give me some books.
Shut up and keep writing.
But yeah. So I don't know. I really like Supreme, as I've said multiple times throughout this podcast. It's such a unique comic. It was like you were saying, Tim, and I mean I agree. It was profoundly influential on me, on like how I want to write superhero comics, because I do have some superhero comics that I write, and I want to be able to capture that like contemporary adult storytelling, but with the fun, irreverent tone that a superhero comic can have. And I think it's really hard. I just don't see a lot of superhero comics that do that. I think Invincible was doing that for a while.
Yeah, it started out doing that, but then it just became more tired.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to it. I stopped reading it after about 40 issues, I think, which was a long time ago at this point.
Also, 40 issues is a lot of issues, so you really put up with it.
Oh, I mean, Robert Kirkman, he's kind of a popular writer.
Yeah, Walking Dead, kind of popular.
Good for him. Well, anyway, I think that's about going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being on the show and talking about Supreme. Anthony, thank you for reading Supreme, even though I know it's something that you probably didn't have a immediate desire to check out.
Hey, it's another tick off my Alan
There you
Moore
go.
box.
Yeah, now you can just speak with that much more knowledge when you talk about Alan Moore. You've got gained knowledge.
We got to cross Promethea off the list, and in the very, very far, far distant future, if you're still doing this, we'll do Lost Girls.
You know what? I have both of those books, and I would like to do a podcast on all of those. So we'll sit down and do some Promethea, and then in the far future, we'll talk about doing Lost Girls. Yes. Thank you guys, again, as I was saying, for being on the show. Thank you, everybody, for listening. My name is Aaron Walther. You can find comics that I have written at newhavencomics.com. Some of them completely rip off this Comic Supreme that we were just talking about. I steal many, many jokes and clever moments from Alan Moore and put them into my own comics. Please don't tell anybody. You can find me on Twitter. I am at AAWALTHER. That's at AAWalther on Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook, Aaron Walther on Facebook. And you can find new episodes of this very podcast at comicdna.podbean.com. And Tim, I don't remember. Are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter at my Twitter name is at @Albaugh84. And also I have a comic book. I have the Celestial on pages of it are available for free on newhavencomics.com.
And Anthony, where can people? Well, we didn't really talk about it at the beginning of the episode, but do you have anything new that you're working on, and where can people find it?
Oh man, we're always working on stuff. I just got done actually doing 3 months of Kickstarters. If you can believe that.
You know what? I donated. I think I only backed 2 of them. What was the third one?
We did Supreme.
Team, not
Supreme
to be confused with Supreme, the comic we just read.
It's a very different book. And then not influenced by Supreme in the slightest. So we did that, and then we did the Apocalypse anthology, and then we just in this October we did the Out of the Blue, a collection of campfire tales, which was a horror anthology, and that was really cool because we released the digital on Halloween.
Oh, that's great.
So that was fun.
I forgot. I saw some people that I know were in that book that were promoting it, and I completely forgot to back that Kickstarter.
And it was a real treat for me because a lot of my favorites in there. We had like Larry Connolly came back and did the cover for us, and then we had Kelly Williams, who I love, Joe Badon, who I love. A new dude who I'm hoping to work more with, Walter Osley. Just a lot of really, really great, cool indie comic creators in that book, and it was a lot of fun. It's our best.
That's awesome.
Book.
I'll definitely have to get a copy of it next time I'm at a convention with you guys.
So right now, I guess one of the couple things I'm working on, we're getting ready to do another anthology. I'll be working with Ryan Burst, who does the subreddit Make Comics.
Okay, yeah.
And hopefully set a Guinness Book of World Records with that. Details
cool.
later.
Oh, interesting.
And then the other thing is the variant cover artist for Out of the Blue, because we did like a Kickstarter hardcover, Alberto Pessoa. He's a sociology professor, and he did a lot of work with prostitutes in Brazil, learning about their lives and stuff like that. And he turned that into a graphic novel.
Oh, neat.
Which had limited release there, but I'm working with him on an English translation, and we're going to do new colors for it because it was originally in black and white and expanded a little bit, and be working on a graphic novel in the month of December on that. So I'm really I get excited to work on these.
Yeah, that sounds cool,
projects.
man. Yeah, you always do just like cool and unique comics, not like the boring old like superhero crap that I do.
Well, no, you guys are holding it down, and then I'm gonna go off on these weird tangents that no one reads. No, just kidding. No, I love the art form of comics, and I got into this comic game convinced that it could be used to tell all sorts of different stories. I think we need a little bit more of the other stuff sometimes.
Absolutely, I would agree.
Yeah,
with that.
find me online at AR Mathenia. That's on Twitter. And then also _comics on Twitter, and then Stash Publishing. That's STACHE _publishing.com.
That is awesome. That sounds good. I'm glad you're putting those.
We're doing crazy stuff.
What's that?
So we're doing crazy stuff.
That's exciting to see. I'm really excited to see some of the stuff you got going. I'm excited to get my copy of Supreme Team.
Oh yeah, I gotta apologize because I'm behind on coloring that bad boy.
Well, it sounds like you've been keeping busy though. So
I have. I just you know how it is to be a creator. And you just gotta constantly keep the balls
balancing
moving.
that drive to work with the drive to drink yourself into a coma. Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Well, we can do both. That's why we do
right.
comics.
Alrighty, well, I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you all next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.